is Deniz Göktürk. I'm a professor in the Department of German at UC Berkeley, and I would like to welcome you all very warmly to our fourth Mosse lecture here at Berkeley. Special welcome to the Consul General of Germany in San Francisco, Ilija Trojanow, who is attending. We're very happy you were able to make it. This event is being live streamed on YouTube, so welcome also to our remote listeners. And we are, having said that, we are delighted to hold this event in person at the Brauer Center at Berkeley after a long hiatus due to a halt to public events, as you all know, during the pandemic. Our last Mosse lecture was a conversation with filmmaker Ulrike Oettinger at the Pacific Film Archive back in 2019. And we had actually invited Ilija Trojanow last year, but had to postpone due to ongoing restrictions to international travel. So we are very happy that this is now finally happening in person. Special thanks to our distinguished speaker who has come from afar and has been incredibly generous with his time. He was already here all last week for a writing workshop with colleagues and students from Cologne, Münster, and Berkeley, and all participants benefited greatly from our lively discussions at this workshop, from his passion for good prose and his for thorough research and his political engagement, as well as his practical advice on matters of writing. He then went to LA for an event there and is back in Berkeley today for the Mosse lecture before he leaves for New York tomorrow. Thank you so much, Ilija, for being here. Allow me to offer some brief framing remarks about the event, the Mosse lecture, and also, thanks are due. So before we give the stage to Ilija. The Mosse lectures would not be possible without support from the Mosse Foundation. And I would like to thank Roger Strauch from the Mosse Foundation for generously enabling these public events and helping to establish the Mosse lecture here at Berkeley. Roger, who is a bi-coastal entrepreneur and philanthropist with a foot at Berkeley, has been pursuing a quest for the lost and stolen art, once owned by the Mosse family, a Jewish German family that was of great significance for the economy, cultural life, and the arts in Imperial Germany and the Weimar Republic. Here in the United States, a first association with the Mosse name for many of you will be the famous historian, George Mosse, an emigre from Nazi Germany who taught for many years at the University of Wisconsin at Madison, where Mosse lectures have been held in his memory. These days you can also stream them online on YouTube. In Berlin, however, the associations with the Mosse name resonate further back to Rudolf Mosse, media mogul of the Weimar Republic and the inventor of modern advertising. The headquarters of his important newspaper, Berliner Tageblatt, were located at the Mosse House in Berlin-Mitte, not too far from Humboldt University, where the Mosse lectures have been held as a prominent public humanities event ever since 1997. Ours is a much smaller enterprise. We do, aspire to one a year. but we are very pleased to be associated with these events on an international scale. And many thanks also to our co-sponsors, the Institute for European Studies and the German Historical Institute, in particular Heike Friedman and Ray Savard, whom you already met outside. They have been a tremendous help with organizing this event and with publicity. Ray actually designed the poster that you're looking at and has been a wonderful support on all fronts. Putting this together, he's around and, very eager to help. He's outside right now. So he both, thank you, Heike, thank you, Ray. I'd also like to mention our tech support, Chris, behind the scenes. Yes, he's waving there. His music was playing earlier on as you were walking in. The Woodies? Woody. He's a band member with the Woodies. So, also the newly established Environmental Arts and Humanities Network is a co-sponsor. Many thanks to Linda Rugg in absentia. She couldn't make it today for spearheading this initiative. So the ecological focus of our location, the Brouwer Center, and today's topic of utopian literature and its possibilities resonate well with the goals of this group, the Environmental Arts and Humanities Network. So Ilija Trojanow will speak to us as a novelist who has spent the past years exploring the history of Utopia and working on a utopian novel to be published next year. He's a political activist who is very engaged in Penn, Germany. He initiated der Utopische Raum, the Utopian space, a multimedia platform for debate on visionary, provocative thinking in Vienna, Frankfurt, and I think Hamburg. A recent television documentary produced by Dreisat and ORF, the Austrian channel, Oasen der Freiheit, features the writer traveling to explore various utopian experiments. It is to be found on YouTube. So at a time when news of droughts and floods and war and destruction and violence and hunger dominate our minds and screens, as we reckon with humankind's destruction of nature, Ilija calls for a reboot of utopianism and reminds us of literature's potential to imagine alternatives and possibilities. Ilija Trojanow is the most worldly and well-traveled among writers in the German language, I think. Carrie Smith-Pray has called him a cosmopolitical public intellectual. He is a prolific transnational writer, translator, and editor who works across languages as a Sprachwechsler, a language shifter, and has published some 40 books, I think. I stopped counting, but many of which have been translated into multiple languages, including Bulgarian and Turkish. So born in Bulgaria, he has lived in Germany, Kenya, India, and Austria. In 2001, he crossed Tanzania on foot, retracing the roots of British Orientalist explorer Sir Richard Francis Burton, whom he featured in his best-selling novel, Der Weltensammler, The Collector of Worlds, which was awarded the prize of the Leipzig Book Fair in 2006. Another book that is devoted to Richard Burton is the Nomade auf 4 Kontinenten, a nomad on 4 continents. He has reported regularly on India, Africa, and other parts of the world for newspapers such as Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, Süddeutsche Zeitung, Neue Zürcher Zeitung, and die Taz, die Tageszeitung, and has published multiple volumes of collected essays, continues to write about current affairs in a column in the Taz, regularly in Schlagloch. So with Ranjit Hoskote, he co-authored Kampfabsage. English translation is Confluences, Forgotten Histories from East and West. And in his eco-fictional novel Eistau, translated as The Lamentations of Zeno, he took on the melting glaciers and travels to Antarctica. We might hear a very brief passage from that book at the very end of today's discussion. So further recent books include Macht und Widerstand, Power and Resistance, the gripping memories of an aging dissident in Bulgaria, and Nach der Flucht, After Flight, which isn't out in translation yet, but being translated, a book inspired by African-American painter Jacob Lawrence's Migration series and composed of aphorisms and short scenes that encapsulate the experience of exile. The essay Hilfe, 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 Wege aus der globalen Krise, Aid, Ways Out of Global Crisis, co-authored with Thomas Gebauer, offers a critique of philanthropy. And then most recently the novel Doppelte Spur, Dual Trace, published in 2020, is a Cold War novel about a dual agent. He's a masterful narrator, and I think he might well be Germany's candidate for the Nobel Prize someday. So let us open our minds to utopian impulses. There will be an opportunity to engage in discussion after the talk. And you're also welcome to stay for conversation over a little reception we've planned in the foyer, which I think is being set up as we speak. We can only serve wine and water to those in attendance. No way to do that remotely through YouTube, but we will make sure to raise a glass to everyone out there. So please join me in welcoming Ilija Trojanow. Ilija, thanks for coming. The floor is yours.
Well, good afternoon or good evening or good morning, whatever you prefer. Thank you very much, Denise. And thanks so much for the invitation. It's really wonderful to be here. I don't know whether you know Nasruddin Hoxha, my favorite trickster, a kind of oriental wise fool, or maybe a foolish philosopher. One day he was invited to give the sermon at the local mosque. So after Friday prayers, he went forward, he stood up, and he asked the congregation, "Do you know what I will talk about?" People shook their heads and said no. To which he replied, "Well, if you don't know what I'm going to talk about, what's the point of me talking to you?" And he left. Next week, he was invited again to give the sermon at the local mosque. So after Juma Salah, he went up, he looked at the congregation and he said, "Do you know what I am going to talk about?" Of course, people had wisened up by then, and they said, "Yes, sure." So he said, "Well, if you know what I'm going to talk about, what's the point of talking to you?" And he left. Next week, he was once again invited to give the sermon, which tells you a lot about the patience of the imam in that particular mosque. So he went up and he looked at the congregation and said, "Do you know what I will talk about?" Now, people had really spent the week thinking of the right answer. So half of the congregation said, yes, of course. Half of the congregation said, no, how could we? At which Nasruddin Hoxha said, perfect. So those in the know can explain it to those who do not know. Have a good day. And he left. So do you know what I'm going to talk about? Well, maybe not. After all, this talk is on utopian thinking and storytelling, and thus it is a wager on a not yet, propelled into existence by extending the imagination of the moment into a vision of moments to come, manifold and surprising. But not only surprising, also liberating in different directions. Into the past, for memory is usually wrapped up in power, and utopia unwraps it. And into the future, utopia liberates the imagination from the constraints of feasibility. In other words, future is what could be different, history is what might have been different, and the two are interrelated. Utopia has to be rooted in historical experience, because every utopian idea asserts certain axioms about human behavior and social organization. And if these are not confirmed by experience, at least to a certain extent, the utopian vision has only a metaphysical, not to say eschatological meaning. Utopian thinking challenges the debilitating inertia that emerges from an understanding of change arriving either too late or too soon. So the polite people in the mosque listening to Nasruddin Hoxha are unaware of what they will be told. They are too early. But then they claim to be in the know, wrongly so, thus they are too late. They are caught up in the present, subjected to a contemporary that is becoming, if we apply the story to our times, increasingly self-satisfied and lethargic. For many people nowadays, the past is defined by nostalgia, an affliction that makes vast claims regarding a home that never existed, an invented lost paradise. And the future is contaminated with fear and angst, with apocalyptic horror stories. You just have to look at TV shows on Netflix or at any other form of popular art at the moment. It's dystopian to the extreme. Frustration and a feeding frenzy is the logical reaction, which is exactly why we need utopia now more than ever. It's important not to confuse what does not exist with what seems impossible, which is how most people use the word utopian in everyday parlance. Tell the sun to leave the sky, to quote an old evergreen. Now that is impossible, unless, of course, you can privatize the sun. Abolish slavery, give women the right to vote, exterminate hunger. That seemed impossible for quite a while. Progress has at times been utopia come true. By envisaging differing realities, we are imagining alternatives into existence. This is what Robert Musil, the great Austrian author, famously meant by Möglichkeitssinn. Difficult to translate, but not impossible. Well, impossible for me, but I'm sure some of you can translate it. However, there's an essential difference between a political manifesto that claims to be utopian and utopian storytelling. According to a definition of the Indian art theorist Nancy Adajania, the political manifesto announces, and I quote, This morning we declare the advent of tomorrow. We proclaim that now is the future, but most of you are yesterday, or will be if you do not recognize the truth of our observations. You would be truest to the time of the now if you were to leap out of it. Now that is a drag, boring and dangerous. Utopian narratives should be the opposite, dealing in the provisional, presenting unfinished visions, so to speak. The reasons are self-evident, I believe. The blueprint of a better tomorrow is a didactic and dogmatic drawing, insisting on exactitude in the realm of imagination. It is a sociology of the fantastic, measured and calculated. Thus, it develops its vision by limiting its scope. Utopian stories should not be the construction plans of overly ambitious architects, but the sharing of a larger horizon, setting the future free of the shackles of the established social, political, and economic orders. For all of us who insist on yearning and dreaming of different forms of social life and individual existence. Truly utopian narratives challenge existing preconceptions by opening windows of thought and fantasy that give life to a multitude of yet-to-be-discovered possibilities. It goes without saying that this form of utopia can only be a work in progress. The exact opposite of, let us say, the Ten Commandments or the will of the Founding Fathers. It is aspirational, not foundational. Grundgesetz, the name of the German constitution, means foundational law, and we can detect a certain obsession with the foundations of democracy, both in the US and in Germany, an attitude typical of building contractors, implying ex negativo that any other structure is a Luftschloss. Beautiful German word, Luftschloss. A castle in the air, a mirage, a daydream. Which, by the way, is how Ernst Bloch, the great philosopher of Utopia, describes the utopian craving as, I quote, Träume von einem besseren Leben voller utopischer Hoffnung und Möglichkeiten. Once again, Möglichkeiten. Dreams of a better life full of utopian hopes and possibilities. No wonder that this is regarded as subversive by the gatekeepers and security guards of the status quo, vilified as dubious or even dangerous. And I learned today, which is a very good example of this, that a certain narrative tradition in China, which was shown on TV and on the internet, engaging in alternate history and in time travel, was forbidden because it seemed subversive to imagine different outcomes and to open our mind to different horizons. So our political architecture is based on the idea of stability. And some might argue that it has to be based on an idea of stability, but every inconsistency and injustice that is written into the foundation is solidified, even fossilized, while the empowering and liberating energy of the political imagination is shunned and negated. Every socio-political space is defined, like the human body, by pre-existing conditions and inherent dogmas that need to be continuously challenged, for they define our understanding of justice and well-being, of happiness and progress. A truly just and inclusive process has to be based on the assumption that convictions and priorities, instruments and institutions are fallible. Incidentally, the German constitution, das Grundgesetz, starts off with an astonishing proclamation. Die Würde des Menschen ist unantastbar. Roughly translated as the dignity of the human being is unassailable. Now, this is either naive or political aspiration. For we know that even in the wealthy societies of the global north, the dignity of some of its citizens is trampled upon. The glorious first article of the German Constitution only makes sense as an ideoscape. And the ideoscape is the topography of Utopia. For a while now, utopian thinking has been made responsible for the horrors of the 20th century, along the lines of Karl Popper's famous argument that every utopia, by definition, is a totalitarian concept that seeks to extinguish any other competing vision. It's understandable that the survivors of the Second World War, exhausted and traumatized, would yearn for pragmatic solutions, for modest words, and even more modest gains. From a historical distance, it seems clear, at least to me, that the totalitarian systems and the state terror in Nazi Germany or the Soviet Union or China were more of a continuation of old principles and mechanisms, such as authoritarian hierarchy, fanatical nationalism, oppressive patriarchy, racism, nepotism, imperialism, and of course, capitalism. For even when the state runs the profit-making, exploitative machine, it is still and remains capitalism. The only utopian aspect in these systems of subjugation and repression was in the realm of the rhetorical. The contemporary absence of utopia is a debilitating social restriction. By the way, if you leaf through a bibliography of utopian writing, which exists, you will notice that eras of progress and of cultural and democratic flowering were accompanied by a wealth of utopian writing. In reactionary times, on the other hand, there is an evident lack of utopian visions. Such an absence is more than just a cause for cultural regret. It represents an existential threat to all of us. Whenever there is a paradigm shift, society requires the wisdom of radical imagination. It is no exaggeration to claim that we are facing the greatest challenge that a complex civilization has ever faced, and that we need to envisage other forms of production, of interaction, of cooperation than the predominant ones, both nationally and globally. Let us take one random example. In one episode of the TV show Shark Tank, I don't know whether you know it, this year a technical solution was presented by a young entrepreneur to a major crisis, plastic. This particular man had invented edible cutlery, perfect for fast food joints, ice cream parlors, motels, picnics, maybe even universities. The sweet or savory spoons, forks, knives, and even chopsticks are not only ecological, but even tasty. However, the sharks, these giants of entrepreneurial acumen, refused to invest in the business called Incredible Eats. They worried about the 10 to 15 cents markup that might scare away big companies, deliberating whether to exchange plastic for something good for the planet. One shark after the other proclaimed to be terribly worried about the effects of plastic. And they probably know, as we do, that by the year 2050, the amount of plastic in our oceans will exceed the number of fish. So if you go fishing, you will be fishing for plastic. Probably a new definition of fishing. But saving the planet is bad for business. So on we pollute. The utopian storyteller on the other side would be happily munching on sporks made of wheat, oats, corn, chickpeas, or brown rice. Why not? His starting or her starting point is the horizon, not single-entry bookkeeping. Unfortunately, globalism means that this juggernaut we call capitalism truly rules the whole universe, as, by the way, the Sanskrit meaning of Jagannath foretold, without exception. And this in itself is a terrifying thought. Monoculture is bad enough in agriculture. In the political realm, as we're gradually realizing, it spells doom. In order to survive, we will have to redefine our modes of planetary existence, and this will be impossible without powerful utopian imagination. Thus, utopia is not the art of the impossible. It is the rationale of the necessary. Other authors have accused utopian thinking of being crypto-religious, as if that were bad. What is wrong with a little bit of secular faith, with the belief in a life worth living for everyone in universal communion? Having faith in freedom or justice means believing in something that will always be fragile and contested, even if we assume it will be attained in a more meaningful way than it is today. What I mean is a world of becoming. If I assume that I'm partially blind because of my cognitive limitations, as well as because of the mindset of the zeitgeist, I must virtually break out into the otherworldly in order to overcome my blindness. If I cannot see the present clearly, I have no choice but to look more closely at the future. In this sense, utopia is the healing of one's partial or willful blindness. But utopia is a marvel only in relation to our ignorance. In another world, the world of imagination, the world of the novelist, the world that I will now speak about, it might be as normal as, let us say, marshmallows or socks with holes in them. Which is how we arrive at the question, how do you write a utopian novel? It's actually quite a difficult question. The practical execution. Writing a utopian novel means translating, evidently, all these theoretical concepts into literary forms. Most utopian novels, however, until now, have not been mindful of the difference between manifesto and storytelling, between blueprint and blue smoke. They have embarked on their visions of transformation with the attitude of bookkeepers. A fine example is the novel titled Utopia by Ernest Kallenbach, published in Berkeley, of course, in 1975. Ernest Kallenbach worked as an editor and taught at this very university, mostly film studies. It tells the story of the first American to visit the new country of Utopia, a breakaway nation consisting of California, Oregon, and Washington State, since its independence 19 years earlier. So the very first visitor, which in itself is a very common topos in utopian writing. The ecological visions in these novels are programmatic and detailed, which is why the main character is a journalist and his reporting is a documentation of a well-defined alternative reality. Many aspects in this country called Utopia are different to what we are now accustomed to. For example, people seem to be very loose and playful with one another, as if they had endless time on their hands to explore whatever possibilities might come up. Some are surprisingly similar to our times. For example, the head of state is a president in charge of a conventional cabinet of ministers. Some are very close to the heart of this reader. For example, the buses creep along at 10 miles an hour, for no one is in a hurry. Others are less endearing to me. For example, there still exists an army. The readers are offered a cold buffet of alternative ideas. The choice is theirs, but all the appetizers are covered in aspic. This is a language of premeditated transformation, not a venture into the unknown whose topography will have to be navigated and negotiated. This particular storyteller has drawn a precise map before setting out on his journey. He cannot be surprised by waterfalls, trapdoors, or turning tables. And as in any other science fiction novel, some details are surprisingly clairvoyant in true Jules Verne style. Citation: feeling that they could transport their bodies only when it is a pleasure, they seldom travel on business in our manner. Instead, they tend to transact business by breaking something. Thank you. Maybe I'll put this one away as well. So feeling that they should transport their bodies only when it is a pleasure, they seldom travel on business in our manner. Instead, they tend to transact business by using Zoom. I changed one word of that sentence. Others are less convincing 5 decades after publication. So this particular utopian novel, this style of utopian writing, is a question of hit and miss. The disappointment of the readers lies, I believe, somewhere else. Like most other utopian novels, Utopia presents a closed system of thought. We are invited into a Luftschloss, a castle in the air, but the rooms therein are not ephemeral. They are completely furnished, including carpets, fittings, all the furniture, everything. They mirror in a progressive way Hearst Castle, if you've been there. There's a very stark contrast between a fluid exterior and a rigid interior. We follow an invitation into the unknown, only to discover that we are being held hostage by a know-it-all. And that experience is rather frustrating. I strongly feel that a utopian novel worth its salt has to be an open work of art, open-minded, open-hearted, full of open doors and open spaces, defined not by the exactitude of an alternate vision, but by playfulness, ambiguity, and risk-taking. George Orwell famously remarked that, and I cite, all utopias seem to be alike in postulating perfection while being unable to suggest happiness. The opposite would be preferable, imperfect imaginings suggesting happiness. One way to go about this is by taking the human being seriously as homo ludens. The excitement of utopian thinking translated into literary playfulness. Art has always offered spaces free of concepts of utility. And like a magician's wand, playful poetics can turn realities upside down, invent new rules, disorient, and refocus on a different plane. And on a visceral level, playing is fun, and utopian storytelling needs to encapsulate a certain joie de vivre. By celebrating the limitless possibilities of literature, that kind of utopian novel can celebrate the existential excitement that some of us feel when we encounter utopian thinking. I started off by speaking of the close link between the past and the future in utopian thinking, And to me, writing this novel, this has been the central challenge. I had to come to terms with two different concepts of time, the chronos and the kairos. Chronos, of course, is the continuity and stability of time. Once again, stability. Its unchangeable flow. Kairos, on the other hand, is the moment of change or renewal, a fleeting opportunity to be seized, a crystallization point, a dramatic point of no return. Suddenly, anything seems possible, the floodgates of transformation are opened. The Egyptian artist Ahmed Basyouni demonstrated this difference in his work and his activism. In 2010, he was the performer in his own installation called 30 Days of Running in the Place. He ran and ran and ran on the spot. The title expresses the frustration of chronos dominating life. We are moving but getting nowhere. The time spent is not an opportunity won. We are victims of the merciless punishment that Sisyphus has to endure. Exactly 1 year later, Ahmed Basyouni participated in the protests on Tahrir Square and was killed on January 28, 2011. As a citizen, he had sensed the revolutionary moment and had tried to seize it, tried to seize the kairos, so to speak. In my Utopian novel, which is still a work in progress, a group of young activists called the Chronauts make good use of time travel in order to go back in history and search for the elusive moments of kairos that might, or might not, no one knows, change the course of destiny. The ambivalences and varieties of utopian life are mirrored, thematically as well as stylistically, in the different historical eras they visit. Eras seemingly known to us, but rediscovered through the eyes of these time travelers from the unknown country of Utopia, who are finding it hard to make sense of what for us is normal. And the interesting thing is that writing this novel, I had to force myself to rediscover the abnormal in what all my life has seemed normal. But once I rediscovered it through the literary process of imagination, I then had great difficulties re-entering the realm of normalcy. So I find our world even more abnormal than when I started writing this particular novel. And thus, hopefully, it will gradually dawn on the reader that utopia, according to the meaning of the word, is not only a place without a place, but also situated in time, in a multiverse in which kairos continuously challenges chronos. And this is why the wonderful American novelist Edward Abbey, a major influence on Ernest Kallenbach, is the better writer. His Back to the Future stories are situated on a timeline between an appreciation of nature, a very passionate appreciation, and a strong hatred for our form of civilization. Kairos, for Edward Abbey, lies in acts of rebellion that punctuate the arrogant, unerring chronos of our civilization. And the small flashes of utopia in his work seem to be more convincing than the well-lit halls of Kallenbach's detail-obsessed Ecotopia. In other words, utopian narratives have a tendency to turn their own imagination into museums, thus stifling the imagination of the potential reader. Some of the earlier utopian communities in fiction Just to name a few examples, the novels of Edward Bellamy, of course the famous one by Thomas More, Morus, or a not so famous one by the psychologist B.F. Skinner, and some experimental utopian communities in real life, such as the Cavea Commonwealth in late 19th century California, which was directly inspired, by the way, by Bellamy's novel A Look Back from the year 2000, which was the last global huge success by a utopian novel, actually inspiring groups of Bellamy-oriented communities around the world. These experiments and these novels sought to eliminate risk and make the government fully take care of everyone's needs, which is an expectation we could discuss politically, but I think it's not very good for literature. In literary terms, I prefer a different kind of utopia, one that includes risk, adventure, and of course humor. Our need for meaning, bonding, and pleasurable stimulation are just as biologically rooted in us as our needs for survival and our craving for security. One might even claim that we are born with a yearning for utopia. As human beings, we often tolerate the intolerable because of our fear of the unknown. As societies, we uphold the unjustifiable because we are wary of change. The utopian novel has to practice and exhort risk-taking. It should consist of many leaps of faith, leaps of hope, of playful creativity, and of provocation. Or, to summarize the whole talk in one Twitter sentence, in Utopia we trust.
Dann mit der Pumpgun und wir singen im Atomschutzbunker. Hurra, diese Welt geht unter. Hurra, diese Welt geht unter. Hurra, diese Welt geht unter. Und wir singen im Atomschutzbunker. Hurra, diese Welt geht unter. Hurra, diese Welt geht unter. Auf den Trümmern das Paradies. Nimm dir Pfeil und Bogen, wir erlegen einen Leckerbissen. Es gibt keinen Knast mehr, wir grillen auf den Gefängnisgittern.
surprised us with wanting to show this video at the end of his talk, and Ambika, who is yes, did a translation last night. I just learned actually that this was also, I'd seen it before in Berlin contexts. You know, KIZ is a well-known band. But I just learned that it was actually also played at the Fridays for Future as a sort of, you know, unofficial hymn or anthem quite regularly. So yeah, maybe we can start with, you know, sort of asking you why did you want to end your talk with this video? We also we are in disagreement about the ending. I looked at it again now. We are not clear whether the group on the float is coming into the fallout shelter or whether the singer is coming out to join them on the float. So tell us.
I actually think it makes more sense that I think it's quite brilliant because
It's open.
They liberate the refrain. So on a purely textual level, they liberate the refrain from the fallout center. And of course, the refrain is very simple. Hurra, diese Welt geht unter. While the text is quite complex. So it's kind of the complex text winning over the simplistic refrain, which is how I read it. But no, it's a great new genre. It's the utopian German rap. I mean, who would have thought that we'd see that? And it's very, very well done because it mirrors, I think, anxieties of young people nowadays. Because they have, many of them, those that I know, and many in the Fridays for Future movement, have accepted the fact that we'll be going through some kind of catastrophe. So they play around with very well-known tropes of dystopian narratives. Waterworld, Mad Max, and so on and so forth. But they twist it or turn it around and make it into a utopian narrative. And the text tells loads of stories of how paradise can be made in hell, how out of the catastrophe we can reimagine new beginnings. So which I thought this was a provocative ending to my talk. And I also think it's just absolutely, I think it's absolutely brilliantly done, all aspects of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have, you know, experts on Robert Mosse and Möglichkeiten here in the audience, so there's lots of possibility to engage and raise questions. One thing that was on my mind as I was listening first is that, you know, there might be conflicting utopian visions at work. And in some ways you kind of answered that with your emphasis of openness and closed, you know, sort of closed visions. But you know that's something as we are thinking about the whole polarization around us of, you know, in political debate. You know, so that you know there are very kind of opposite competing ideas, or utopian ideas at play, and you know I wonder how those other utopianists might be won over by literature.
Well, we're going to have to.
Of the ilk that you have in mind.
We're going to have to wait and see.
Yes, but let's open it to questions. That's Philip, right?
So thank you so much. This was really interesting. I have a question on the relationship between utopia and dystopia. You mentioned that with regard to the KIZ song, that there are several dystopian elements in it as well. I wanted to ask how you make sure in your own novel that your utopian novel doesn't turn into a dystopian novel. Because obviously for different people it can be different perspectives if it's utopian or dystopian. So we kind of all agree on what is utopian and dystopian.
I'm actually not sure about that, and I'll tell you why. One of the things I did is after reading dozens of utopian narratives from around the world, I tried to come up with some kind of baseline, some kind of commonness in all these narratives. And I actually managed to extract a certain, let's say, concentrated essence of what people imagine as utopia. Of course, there are different aspects in utopian novels that other people would find absolutely terrifying. That exists. But there's also kind of, there are common elements. So I thought that was very interesting, that apparently this yearning consists of things that we have in common as human beings and other elements that are very, very much in, as you said, in conflict, that will certainly have to be not necessarily resolved, because now coming to your question, one of the ways I deal with this is that the utopian societies are not the same everywhere in the world. So you actually have different, since people are self-organized, societies are self-organized, they find different solutions to common problems. So once again, there's variety and ambiguity and ambivalence. There's not one system that exists throughout the world. So that's one solution. And the other solution is by keeping it, as I said, open in a sense that many of the things are not spelled out. I leave it, it's a sketch, it's a rough sketch, and I leave a lot of the things that need to be kind of added to this vision to the readers. And I find it interesting then to see what's going to happen. How will people fill out the blank spaces? How will they engage in something that is more an invitation to utopian thinking and less a presentation of a finished version? So these are my literary solutions.
I'm actually quite frightened of Utopia, and in many ways, because if you look at it historically, it's got us in trouble, as you very well explained.
And challenged.
And yes, too, that's true. But in all the novels you mentioned, and I share your sense that they are, as literary pieces, are rather mediocre. Edward Bellamy would be a classic example. Quite frightening, too, in the sense that there's a regimented government, state-focused trajectory. What do you make of the argument, though, just to turn around,
Yeah, sure.
that actually the only kind of utopia that can really emerge is one that emerges at a point when mankind has lost all hope, when in a sort of postmodernist sense, stripped of all delusions, we're sort of facing the reality of being. We even stripped of the idea of making meaning. And it's only at that point that kairos, as you explained, can emerge, rather than holding on to some sort of hope, some sort of delusion that might lead us down the garden path.
Yeah. That's kind of the practical approach. I would argue that the reason one could have that perspective, and I can understand how you would reach that point of view, I would argue that the reason is that the utopias that have been then in a certain way brought to life, that have been then accomplished, after a certain period of time become completely self-evidently natural to us. And we've forgotten that they were once utopias. We become accustomed, I think, to a utopia fulfilled. It's a bit like when your dream comes true, you actually forget what it was to dream of reaching a certain level or accomplishing something. Which is why people actually forget, which I think the study of history is so incredibly important. People forget the process of progress, which I believe exists. It's not a continuous upward movement, but I would definitely argue that, as I mentioned, overcoming, in parts of the world at least, slavery or women not having the right to vote, and I could add dozens of other examples, is an objective progress that I would defend. And I would, I think, with very good historical facts, I could argue that this was because people started with visions that at that point of time were completely regarded as completely utopian. I actually looked at the movement to abolish slavery, and it was very interesting because many of the arguments used against Quakers and other early activists in England mirrors the arguments nowadays used against ecological transformation. They actually said this is going to be bad for economy. They actually said we're going to lose a lot of jobs that are connected to the slavery industry, and many other things that are practical if you have a very kind of, if you have an obsession with the present, and completely ludicrous if you have a kind of utopian horizon. And this is why I think we have this kind of, many of us have this distrust. I understand the distrust, but I would invite anyone to prove to me that the great leaps of progress that mankind has made in certain periods of time were not prepared for, were not introduced by what I would regard as utopian thinking in the political sense. I would absolutely agree with you that the literary kind of utopian production has not been on par with the political. I think that, which is why I'm trying to do the impossible, which is why I'm trying to kind of come up with a utopian novel that is not bogged down by all these kind of literary mediocrities, as you say.
Niklas.
I found it very fascinating that some, my fascination with Mosse, how he would set in there with a sense of possibility as something that goes beyond or against concretive.
Mm-hmm.
That maybe also with regard to that last question,
Yeah.
as a unlocking of the imagination that is happening in the text that he produces actually at that time against concrete utopia. I'm just curious about how much that style or that form of writing that he himself thematizes when he talks about utopia and exacta. He also used the word exacta at some point, I think,
Yeah.
with precision. How that style is important for you. That's one.
I would,
that's a
yeah.
question. The other thing with regard to the film, I was really struck by the fact that this being Berkeley, I have to say that it was only men in that film.
Yeah,
There's
which
something masculine about
Yeah.
that kind of utopian imagination, but that's just a facetious comment maybe here, but the style, I'm really interested in that question.
Well, just to answer your second comment, I agree with you. I think the reason is that all the band members are male, and everybody kind of, the whole entourage is male, which is absolutely problematic, I agree, but I think that's the reason why it was made this way, because all of them on the boat, or whatever it is, are singing, so they're kind of both figures in the story as well as performers of this song. I would actually argue, and I don't know whether you would agree, because I'm sure you know much more about Mosse than I do, I would argue that Mann ohne Eigenschaft is partly also a utopian novel. And the reason I say this is because it's one of these books that actually invites you to engage with the enormous erudition and imagination of the author, with a lot of kind of open spaces in between. It feels like this beautiful topography of, again, of possibility, where I can make my own path through it. It's one of these novels, if it is a novel at all, I don't know, where the reader has kind of the freedom of movement, the freedom of intellectual and sensual movement, And that to me would be something that I'm trying to achieve also in my utopian novel. So it has been inspiring in that respect. I don't know whether it's ever discussed in your studies as a utopian novel, a partly utopian novel. I don't know enough about that. But I think one could make an argument in regard to that.
Just a small observation. I found absolutely fascinating how you juxtapose chronos against kairos, literary models, trying to just offer as what sounded from you as a smaller thought model, just perfecting or righting the wrongs of the reality of our times against a model, an adventurous model, a Luftschloss model leading to trial and error and more happiness. But my question would be, is this juxtaposition, is that something that you resort to just to make clear the different concepts? Because I think in real life, there might be a great deal of people who are inclined or finding happiness, so to speak, in their Sisyphus aspects of their lives, and certainly jumping from kairos to kairos in a certain time span can also be quite burdensome
Sure.
if looked at exclusively. I wonder just how you kind of, if you see meeting points or how there should be an amalgam of both ideas.
No, you're absolutely right. I would never suggest that this is the way you should lead your life, kind of leaps from one kairos to the other. However, when we look at memory and how memory functions, it becomes, I think, more complicated in that both individually and as societies, I think we focus more on kairos. And when I look at how literature functions, I think one of the reasons why literature can be so dynamic is that it can capture and encapsulate the moment of kairos in a way that our normal, in brackets, perception does not actually capture it. So this is one of the ways I think literature leads us out of the kind of everyday cognition into an understanding of how time and reality works on a different level. So it's always been something that I've been very interested in, because basically when you're writing novels, you're writing scenes quite often. When you're writing scenes, the scene in itself is a kind of concentrated, dynamical model of kairos, in which, if it's well written, very often you have not only a juxtaposition, not only a certain kind of explosion, but you also have a certain concentrated yearning of the figures involved towards change of some sorts. It could be just a love affair, it could be, I mean, there are of course many, many different options. But there is this moment of a promise of something that might change, and it's a very complex promise because it's a promise of the author to the readers. Sometimes, of course, it's purposely then broken, and it's a promise, of course, or it's a hope that the characters carry within themselves regarding what is about to happen. So this has always been part of my literary process. How do I differentiate between the chronos that exists in the fact that you start at page 1 and you finish at page 500, which in itself, if you just read it in one go, you would have kind of a very clearly demarcated chronological time period. And of course the way you engage with the novel, which I think is a kind of focus on moments of kairos. But as I explained, I think in a utopian novel that's worth its salt, this would have to be more pronounced. There would have to be more reflection. I've now reached the conclusion that you cannot write a utopian novel that has literary value if it's not a philosophical reflection on what is time. So I'm weaving this the more and more I write, the more and more I'm weaving this kind of, essayistic, one would say, reflection on what is time and how does time, what is also the political kind of energy of time into the novel. It's not easy to talk about this theoretically because, of course, when I write, I think in terms of, words and characters and so on and so forth. So it sounds probably a little bit abstract and dry, but believe me, it's very dramatic and dynamic when it's on the page.
So we have a question from Moritz Basler and then Chengxi Tan. Moritz.
Yeah, thank you. Of course, we are all now very eager to read your novel and find out about the solutions that you will find. Now, I thought to myself, there's a whole capitalist market out there for stories, right? We are sold and offered millions of stories in books, in Netflix, in games, everywhere. And we love them, right? They're the stories that we want. And they invent worlds for us, they invent futures for us, they invent alternative families and everything for us. And it's all out there, right? It's all there. This is what capitalism is, right? Diversified in offer. And now I wonder, there's one man, Ilija Trojanow, writing one book, a utopian novel. How is that related to this whole universe of stories and future worlds that is already out there?
Yeah. I wouldn't be a novelist if I didn't believe, and this might sound now absolutely ludicrous to you, but if I didn't believe that every novel I write, as well as every novel that someone I really respect writes, will change storytelling. I think that is the motivation. If one were to think along the lines that you just sketched out, I'm just one more capitalist producer of marketable stories.
I didn't say that.
No, well, you did more or less. If I were to kind of internalize that, I think I wouldn't write novels. Also, I would slightly disagree with you in that if this is the case, if you have such a diversity in capitalist storytelling, why are there no utopian stories? Because I've actually been searching for years now. There's not been a truly utopian novel in a long time. There are certain novels in science fiction which are partly utopian. Some authors in the field of science fiction play around with the conflict between dystopian and utopian ideas. For example, there's Planet A that's utopian, Planet B that's dystopian, things like that. Different in time travel, you have that you go forward to a certain period of time that is more utopian, another period of time that's more dystopian. You have that, but very much within the framework of science fiction, which of course only appeals to certain readers. But in main kind of, what do you call it, mainline fiction or whatever you might call it, mainstream fiction, it's sorely lacking. And so my suggestion to you would be, if the capitalist marketplace allows for every story to blossom, why is this particular genre so underrepresented?
So, insofar as utopia implies kind of a space of possibilities, or unbounded space of these possibilities, then it must also encompass different kinds of historical experiences, different civilizational achievements, different cultures, different literary traditions, and different modes of imagination that can be realized only in different literary and cultural traditions. In the after the kind of the catastrophe of the Second World War, Karl Jaspers wrote his book on the origin and goal of history, in which he developed his famous theory of axial time. And one kind of conclusion, or one argument that we can draw from that book is that there are different kind of civilizational traditions, and that need to be all taken into account, and be. So you mentioned the West, Europe, India, and China, right? So only if we, I think, as I think Jaspers did, only if we take into account different kinds of civilizational achievements, different historical experiences, different intellectual traditions, is actually kind of a utopia. Actually, then it's the space of possibilities actually possible, right? Because if you are confined just within one civilizational space, then maybe then it's just not. Then it's not really kind of unbounded. So my question here, I know that you have traveled a lot around the world and lived in so many places, and now you write mainly in German. So you are thinking and you are writing, are they located in a particular literary and civilizational tradition? Is your utopia kind of a space in which the world somehow, let's say, is harmonized instead of clash of civilizations and great power rivalries and those kind of things? So where is your imagination, your writing actually located?
That's a very good question. I actually thought of speaking about that particular subject as well, but I realized that I would need another half an hour, because that is kind of the essence of my writing. So I draw on many different traditions. So writing this novel, I am as attuned to, let's say, African traditions of non-hierarchical societies which actually existed until recently. As a publisher, as a young publisher focusing on Africa, I published a book on, for example, on how games and playing has a different social cultural importance in traditional African societies, which to me was a very important book, because we regard now playing, or at least that was the way I was brought up, as something as a kind of luxury that you're allowed to engage in after you finished your homework, that kind of thing. And there was this whole idea of kind of playing games as the central mode of education in these other societies. But also I draw from different concepts of Indian philosophy, and so on and so forth. I don't want to spell it all out. In terms of the novel, it is partly set in clearly defined localities with clearly defined cultural and civilizational backgrounds, and it's partly set in places which are not culturally defined. So there again, I play with, let's say, if it's a huge canvas, you would have parts that are very precisely defined in terms of the cultural spaces, and other parts which are more kind of open, and where the cultural influences are not clearly visible to the readers. But once again, I think they can draw certain conclusions, or they can kind of inject their own cultural preferences into that particular part of the narrative. So it's again a very playful organization of the specific and the non-specific.
Yeah, in terms of your engagements, I think you also oscillate between, some very situated engagements, but also then very international.
By the way, just to remember one small anecdote, just to show you how it works. You mentioned that I walked through Tanzania for 3 months, retracing the steps of the first European who actually went into mainland East Africa. Richard Burton, the famous Burton Speak exhibition. So I came to a small marketplace, and there was a woman selling peanuts. And the peanuts were in funnels, one old newspapers, and one was small and one was big. And I asked, how much is the small one? And she said 5 shillings. And I said, how much is the big one? And she said 5 shillings. I looked at her and I said, so who's going to buy the small one if, you know, they're both the same price? And she looked at me, smiled, and said, people less greedy than you are. Now that is anecdotal, but at the same time, it opens my mind to all sorts of utopian ideas where I would start off at the end, which is the way we price things is completely ridiculous and wrong. How could we price it absolutely differently? Number one, by including the ecological price, which I think meanwhile is well accepted by anyone who thinks ecologically. But secondly, by actually encouraging people to take what they need and not what they can afford. And now we could have a huge argument about whether that's sensible or nonsensical and so forth. But I just wanted to show you the process of my thinking. So I use something like that, and then I start at kind of an imagined perfect ending, for me perfect, and then I look at the possibilities of rearranging behavior, attitudes, beliefs, and so on and so forth.
Peng Chia has a question.
You began by saying that the utopian is not impossible. Can you say a little bit more about the relation of the utopian to the possible, or possibility as such? I mean, I assume the utopian for you is not the ideal.
Mm-hmm.
And from what you said, it does not have a regulated function in the sense that you're against utopian literature that sketches out a blueprint that serves as a guideline for people to try to actualize. So what exactly is the relation between the utopian and the possible? And then the second question is, I mean, all the literature that you mentioned, it's all narrative fiction. Is there a special affinity between the utopian dimension and narrative literature, or can you think of other modes of literature that could also be utopian?
Yeah. Well, to answer your second question, because that's the easier one to answer, of course there are many other, it's just that because I'm a novelist myself, that's the only reason I focused on it. Of course, mentioning someone like Ernst Bloch, I mean, that's I think a hugely valuable book. And there are many others like that, both in philosophy and sociology and so on and so forth. Of course, partly in the history of film, and I would also argue that in some games, for example, some games also include, I think, wonderful utopian dimensions. The only reason I focused here was because I wanted to give you a sense of how my writing a utopian novel is inspired by these particular thoughts. Now, the first question is a really difficult one because I've been struggling for years, because I think we have to, the only way to respond to it would be to take the paradox seriously. So it is not impossible, but at the same time, it is not the promised land. It is not kind of, as I mentioned, eschatological. It is not finite. It is something like a mixture of promise and movement. And there's a lot of negotiation going on, both within oneself as well as with other texts and other people or other forms of art. So I don't think there's any other way, which is why I started with Nasruddin Hoxha, who's a master of the paradox. I don't think there's any other way than to accept the paradox, which to me comes quite easily, because I think the paradox is an instrument of elucidation, of maybe even of profound wisdom and knowledge. The moment you try to bend it into a kind of logical system of continuity and consequence, I think you get these blueprints. So there has to be a certain acceptance of the paradoxical complexities of this movement that have a belief in things could be, as I said, completely different. My argument would be that if I can imagine it in a novel, it is potentially possible. If the human imagination can make it into a text, that text itself is already a proof of life. Of course, as a novelist, I'm not all that interested at the moment whether it will become reality in 50 or 100 years. But I think I think every novelist believes that if the narrative is convincing, it exists. And if the reader believes in it, there you are. It's both possible, but also, at the moment, unfeasibly hopeful, and it's all these things put together.
Wonderful. Ambika, yeah?
I just have one question to you, that it seems like the novel is a form that I think is very much based around the individual agency plays a big role in novels, and it strikes me that a lot of representations of utopia, like for example in the song, are collective. And I was wondering how, for you, utopia, what is the relationship between utopia and collectivism for you?
Yeah, that's really an absolutely wonderful question, because it's one of the things I struggle with every day. Because if you're absolutely right, of course, the storytelling is always an exercise in picking certain individuals and then accompanying them in their journey as heroes or whatever they might be. But if I focus too much just on the individual, I miss out on something which I would say is kind of the collective energy, the collective wisdom, the collective yearning that has to be fulfilled as well. Because if you imagine it breaking up into a multitude of individuals that do not communicate with one another, that do not have a common language, then of course the utopian aspect of the novel would not be convincing. So I actually have to find a fine balance between a certain sense of the collective dynamic and individual experience and individual drama. And that is, you're absolutely right, that's a big challenge. Whether I've succeeded is for you to decide.
I think we did ask Ilija to give a lecture and not a reading, but we'd also thought it would be a shame if we let him go without at least having him read a small passage to show that he is a great narrator, and being in this ecology conscious space, we thought the glacier novel would be a great way to end before we proceed to get a glass of something. Yes, Eistau in German and The Lamentations of Zeno in English, and you're going to read something from chapter 6, I think.
Yeah, just a short piece of baklava at the end. I have to start off by saying that it's translated by Philip Böhm, who I think is a brilliant translator. He's also translated a lot of Hertha Müller, for example, and a few other great contemporary German novelists. And just one sentence of introduction. The main character, his name is Zeno in German. And the scene starts off in the Antarctic, actually on the island of South Georgia. He is on a cruise boat for very, very privileged people, a very small and expensive journey. And it then goes back to his glacier in the Alps. He's by profession a glaciologist. A day when clouds look like mountains and mountains like clouds. Alpine peaks spring up in the middle of the ocean. A tear in the sloping cloud bank exposes rocky cliffs and glaciers looming over patches of pasture where reindeer, introduced by homesick Norwegians, chomp away at the vegetation. Trees have never set down their roots. The water inside the pot cove is rich in oxygen and krill and takes on a greenish tint. Creation appears with unfamiliar clarity, as though all our cataracts have been removed and our collective vision suddenly unclouded. We put into Grytviken, an old whaling station abandoned overnight and left to rot in ruin. The passengers stroll from the cemetery to the flensing plant to the mud hole, where elephant seals wallow motionless except when yawning. Our dock is not far from the graveyard, which offers a small but very choice selection. The names are etched in white stone. On calm days, we pay our respects to Sir Ernest Shackleton with a champagne toast. The diesel tanks are lined up as neatly as the graves, a reminder of how much blubber was processed in this cove. Inside the factory, humans, once dismembered whales, now time is dismantling the factory. Silence weighs on the dilapidated halls. The skewers fly in other skies. The whale oil tanks still exude a stench, or so it seems to me. It's hard to breathe in the middle of rusting slaughterworks. Here and there a roof slants downward between the clouds and the tin floor. Red signs mark off an area infested with asbestos. In front of the bone rendering plant, 3 figures clamp their hands around an iron chain and lean back as though in a tug of war with long dead whalers. The snow-covered mountains are mere backdrops, distant and detached. So well hidden are the fur seals, you have to pay close attention not to step on one by accident. The younger seals scamper into the water, twisting in mid-dive, then give themselves a vigorous shake as soon as they crawl ashore. A stand of gentoo penguins keeps watch between an anchor and the ship's propellers, mocking glances behind red beaks. First, the fur seals were skinned, until there weren't any fur seals left. After that, the elephant seals were killed for their blubber, and the tripods were heated with penguins when the fuel ran out. And when there weren't any elephant seals left, the penguins were rendered into oil. Everything was put to good use. Humans are so eager to show nature more efficient ways to manage her resources. I tramp across a gently sloping soccer field. The crooked goalposts a comforting sight. Slaughter by morning, soccer in the afternoon. Did the goalie's hands stink? Were the striker's shins streaked with blood? I leave because I know what they would say. The same thing they always say. How come you have to be so negative? Why do you always insist on ruining the mood? Can't you leave off just for once? The same thing over and over, burbling around me from dawn to dusk. Oh, don't take it so seriously. Come on, man, relax. Stop picking on everything. Turn a blind eye. Things won't work out so bad. Well, you know, nothing's as awful as it seems. Everyone has installed the same software. Deflect, downplay, be ready to duck when the storm hits. I wonder what words would have sprung to their happy lips if they had been hauled off to the clinic at Pentecost, just as summer was setting in, with a persistent pain in the chest, a week of examinations, probes boring into my body as though the pain had to be hauled up from the deep. And then I spent days waiting for the life-saving operation, and after that 3 months recuperating. When the doctors declared I was almost fully recovered, I dropped my bag at home and dashed off to the glacier. The dashed off to the glacier. The host at my guest house picked me up from the railway station. A shaggy dog was panting in the back of his jeep. Oh, I have to tell you, Professor, right away, you're not going to like it. Something has happened, and you're not going to like it. The road was all switchbacks and hairpin turns, with bare landscapes on both sides. Without ice and snow, the Alps are grossly ugly. I'm glad to see you're back in shape. We prayed for you. Our whole family prayed for you. For a moment, I was distracted by a cyclist hurtling downhill. The car swerved left. The wheels grated on the gravel. I looked up through the windshield and saw nothing. No glacier. No living glacier. Only fragments, individual pieces, as though its body had been mangled by a bomb. The escarpment was iced over, but all that was left further down were lumps of darkened ice strewn over the cliff like rubble waiting to be removed from a building site. All life had melted away. I told you it would be hard. It's not a pretty sight. The host's voice evaporates in my memory. Apparently I climbed out of his car without saying a word, staggered from one shard of ice to the other as though drunk or blind, reminding my host of the farmers saying goodbye to their livestock during the mad cow scare. I was not capable of such a gesture. I was too stunned, all thoughts and feelings paralyzed. I knelt next to one of the remnants. The ice under the sooty black layer of dust was clean. I ran my fingers across the cold surface, across my cheek, performing my ritual greeting. In the past, I could plunge my arms into the fresh snow and bring up scoops that made my hands so cold they would revitalize my face. I licked my index finger, it tasted like nothing. Only then did the first trivial thought occur to me, never again would I be able to fill plastic bottles with glacier water to sip so enjoyably at home. My host was standing next to his vehicle. I brusquely signaled for him to leave me alone. I lay down on the scree, all balled up, a picture of misery. I would have welcomed any emotion that did not hit me like a positive lab test result. Not knowing what to do, I stayed like that until a hiker put his hand on my shoulder to check on my condition. I snapped at him, "You are hiking here? It's amazing up here, isn't it? Such a beautiful late summer day. Don't you see what has happened? Oh, well, yeah, not much snow this year. The glacier is dead. And you go sauntering blithely past? Get lost! Disappear, you disgust me." The man did not deign to look at me again and went on with his hike. It would have been pointless to calculate the volume of melt for the September, to take the balance of the summer. There was nothing left to measure, not on this mountain. At some point, I got back on my feet, climbed uphill, heading no place in particular. On steeper terrain, a stump of ice had survived in the shadow of a desk-sized rock. It served as a temporary support. I set down my notebook. The wind leaves through the pages. What hadn't we measured? What hadn't we weighed? And what of all the findings we had compiled, the models we had constructed, the warnings we had issued in careful scientific format? The pages of futility are filled with noble ambitions. They need to be torn out, every last one. Our methods have failed. We issued warnings in vain. Things only worsened with every passing year. Only when it's too late do people hear Cassandra's voice. Today, even more sanguine souls have joined the chorus of doomsayers. Never. Never had I foreseen this degree of destruction. Not when the snout disappeared, I had just turned 50. Not when the tongue broke off and the carved ice melted away as quickly as it did. I had just turned 60. And now this blow from the blind spot of our calculated optimism. if even experts are surprised by the speed of the demise, whose intervention can save anything, whose point of view matters, everyone else hearkens to the rotten core of comfort and convenience. My work had consisted in documenting our delinquency. I pounded my fists on the stone table, and in my pain I thought of the 3 girls I'd met on the train, chewing with difficulty on the gum of life. These 3 girls who pass in the world as innocent. But what is that kind of innocence when we all know they're bound to wind up guilty? That is what lies ahead for them, as well as for all of us. They will continue this devastation. They will go on destroying the foundation of life. They don't give a damn. Just like most of us, just like myself, they will not rest until they've consumed, polluted, squandered, destroyed everything. I left the following morning. In the next valley over, the surviving ice surfaces had been shrouded with white burlap, under which an emaciated glacier was emitting its death rattle, and I felt like a doctor in a hospice.
A dystopian ending.
Yes. I had to recover from that.
Thank you.
But I just have to tell you an anecdote.
Okay.
The leading institute in the world for polar studies is in Bremerhaven, Alfred Wegener Institute. And when I was doing my research, I cooperated with them. And then I gave a reading there at the institute. And there's actually a glaciologist working there who's absolutely Bavarian, exactly like my main character. And I didn't know him. But his wife came up to me after the reading and said, you know what, since I've read your novel, I only call him Zeno. Because he's exactly like this character.
So the dystopian is actually anchored in a character, and that's also important.
And it's anchored in Bremerhaven, of all places.
Yes. Well, we can continue to discuss outside over a glass of wine or water. Thank you all very much for coming, and thank you, Ilija, so much for being here, for your talk and this wonderful reading at the end.